streaming, what happens? It says, oh, do I not have window capture device, video capture device? Here we are. Okay, I think we're live. I think we're going.
Okay.
So we're here to talk about Canada. The audio quality might be terrible today, but doing the best I can. What is going on with Canada? What's happening in Canada these days?
Well, there was an election recently. Justin Trudeau won again. And I think if you want to sort of understand the popularity of people like Trudeau and how, conservatism or right-wing thought is having such a huge up in the U.S. and Europe, but it doesn't seem to be the case in Canada. I think you do have to look at the sort of history of Canadian nationalism, and one of the key points about it is consistently defined by its contrast and by its opposition to America. So, of course, after the American Revolution, you have Canadian loyalists. You have loyalists from America moving over to Canada, and then you have the War of 1812, where I think Thomas Jefferson famously said, it would be a matter of marching. They thought that they would just sort of march in there, and the Canadians would welcome them with open arms and be happy to join America. But that was not the case, and Canada sort of won the War of 1812. And but afterwards, you sort of had a buyer's regret, where the British Empire was it sort of had a tight grip on Canada, and it didn't, and they sort of refused to give Canada any individual autonomy. And so you had the revolutions of 1838, 1837, where a lot of Canadians sort of rioted, and some of them left and joined America. And so the British Empire was at risk of just losing Canada entirely. So the governor at the time, Lord Durham, he wrote a letter to the British, and his proposition was basically, if you don't want to lose Canada, you have to give us some autonomy. But he says, in exchange for that, I will ensure that Canada will be grateful to the British Empire, and will have a strong culture of loyalism. And that is what happened. So you look at Canadian nationalism in the 19th century, and it's at this point it's still a right wing, but it's very tied to loyalism and a sort of Anglophilia. So you'll see, flying the Union Jack, and venerating the British royal family, and relationship to the Commonwealth. And it's also, in terms of the ethnic makeup, a big point of pride for Canadian nationalists at the time was being of a more sort of pure Anglo stock compared to America, whereas America was sort of taking on this pan-European. It wasn't it obviously wasn't as diverse as it is now after the 1965 Pardon Sale Act, but it was just sort of you had sort of this pan-European alliance where various European countries are coming together, whereas Canada was still this perceived as this pure Anglo-Saxon nation. And but gradually you do sort of see Canada pushing for it throughout the later part of the 19th century and the early 20th. You do see Canada gradually sort of asserting independence from the British. And also, as another point, this is why Quebec nationalism is such a big thing, because of course the French aren't too happy about this Anglophilia and this sort of strong Anglo culture being forced down their throats, and they've always had a sort of hostility. You also have the Acadians, who are they were a mix between the French and the indigenous Canadian tribe. I think the tribes were called the Micmac, and they were distinct from the other French colonies, and they were distinct from the British. They sort of lived on the outskirts They engaged in a lot of free trade with not as much tariffs and whatnot. And during the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, all of the almost all of them were expelled, and they went down to Louisiana. There's some in the Caribbean too, and they became the Cajun people. But I'm back to the sort of Anglophilic tendencies of Canada. You see that withering away in the 20th century, and the sort of Canadian nationalism to sort of replace that um, Anglophilic tendency is, and I think the Cold War is a big point. It's an important point. I think that's when a huge shift happens. But the new Canadian nationalism is sort of defined by again an anti-Americanism, but this time it's rather than we're not Americans because we're so British. It's more that we're not Americans because we're so left wing and liberal. Because obviously during the Cold War you have the Soviet Union sort of trying to tarnish the name of America, presenting it as this sort of capitalist, right wing, police state where it's full of racism and whatnot. And Canada Canadians did really caught wind of that, and so they so Canadian nationalism in the 20th century and now is it's all about sort of being more liberal, being more left wing than American. So things like Canada didn't participate in the Vietnam War, and of course the healthcare system. That's one of the biggest points of pride for Canadians. Abortion, tougher on gun rights, um, multiculturalism. All of these things are perceived as being nationalistic because they're seen as being not American. And I have some numbers here. Let me check it. But this is from the Angus Reid Institute. So 64% of Canadians say that America is not racially united, and so you see all these different left wing policies being a sort of a strong point of pride for Canadian people in general, and I think that's why you don't see right wing ideas being as popular because Canadian conservatives are some of them sort of push that we need to go back to being more in line with the British, but that's not popular anymore. I mean, small part due to the fact that Britain is not the superpower that it used to be, and they're sort of seen as being more American-like, and people don't quite like that. Like there's a lot of Canadian conservatives obviously online. You have Gavin McInnes, Stephen Crowder, Lauren Southern, Faith Goldie. I think you'll notice they all sort of if they don't directly portray themselves as American, they go at great lengths to sort of chip away the differences between the two, or to not highlight differences between Canada and the U.S. And but Quebec, interestingly, so while you have this sort of left-wing nationalism taking root in Canada, Quebec is more, I would say, it's more conservative. So like you have, for example, obviously with the immigration policy in Quebec is more exclusionary. They have a lot of like I'm pretty sure that if you're an immigrant to Quebec, you have to learn French, and they actually test you on that. I believe there was a piece of legislation recently which banned religious attire for government workers. So like obviously like the hijab and the like Sikh turban. So Quebec is a bit more, I guess you could say, right wing, like conventionally nationalistic compared to the rest of Canada. But yeah, that's the situation that you have. Nationalism is it's very difficult for nationalists to take root in Canada because of this sort of unique position of being of right wing ideas being seen as more American. Like you'll hear American leftists sort of say, or American liberals more so, say, "Oh, we should be more like the Scandinavian countries, or we should be more like Canada." But it's the opposite in Canada. There's a big emphasis on not being American. So yeah,
Okay, so one of the questions I have for you is I'm looking at a map here of I guess I should look at the map in 1776, North America, 1776. Um, so, in America, we're taught that there were these 13 colonies and that, we had a revolution against the British to have independence. And so, my question here is why and how there was, as far as I never hear about Canada in terms of the Revolutionary War. So how do you explain the fact that what was unique about Canada? Because like I know in the American South people weren't super excited about the American Revolution, but they still got it accomplished in, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia. Most of the revolutionary activity was around Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and New York to an extent. Um, and the reason I have for that, or the way I try to explain that, is that the Northern Puritan culture was more revolutionary, had a history, in fact, going back to the English Civil War, being opposed to the English monarchy, whereas the Southerners who were more Episcopalian, more therefore at that time more Anglican, were less likely to be revolutionary. So, do you know anything about maybe the religious makeup of Canada at the time? That the settlement. I know Quebec, being French, being Catholic, that would. I mean, I guess that could go either way depending on how you look at it. But who are like Seeds of Albion talks about this settlement of America, but what about Canada? Like, was it majority Episcopalian? Was it majority Puritan? Um, who settled? Who were the kind of English settlers that founded Canada?
To my understanding, it was majority Puritan. So, of course, you talked about Albion Seed, this book, which it talks about the sort of four folkways of America, and you have the Puritans from, I believe it was East Anglia. You have the Cavaliers, who were these sort of former aristocrats from England. You have the Borderers, and the Borderers who were, or the Scotch Irish, but Scotch Irish, I've heard that it's sort of a misnomer. But the Borderers make up a lot of the South, and well, really, I would say that they're probably the most influential group. And then you have the Quakers, who have this sort of much more, egalitarian. Um, they're called the Society of Friends. Their religion is really based around sort of openness to new people. And I think you have I think with Canada, you do with the Canadian colonies, you do have a more sort of Puritan and Cavalier culture, which was less hostile to the British. Whereas with the American Revolution, I would credit the sort of strong border or Scotch Irish influence um, to that, and perhaps the Quakers too, with the sort of emphasis on egalitarianism and perhaps like a hostility towards the crown. I mean, the borderers, they come. I mean, of course, they come. The name comes from the fact that they were in between the border between Scotland and England. Two countries that are like almost always at war, and they sort of have this sort of rough and tumble. You know, I don't want to say barbaric, but more like lawless sort of culture. They don't take kindly to the sort of rigid aristocracy of the English, and I think that sort of sentiment can explain a lot of the American revolutionary tendencies, and that's why. And I think that's why because I don't think that you have much of a border influence in the northern Canadian colonies. You really don't. The borders, of course, they went to Pennsylvania. They were kicked out by the Quakers, even though the Quakers were really open-minded and accepting of different groups, much more so than the Puritans. The Quakers did kick them out, and then they sort of settled westward. They settled part of the South. Like I said, I really do think they're the biggest influence on modern, well, just American culture in general. So yeah, I would say I would credit the sort of lack of a lack of that sort of rough and tumble revolutionary, hostile to aristocracy, hostile to uh, British authority culture. And of course, then you have like after the American Revolution, you have migration. So I think it was like millions of loyalists fled to Canada, and that's why they weren't able to because there's such a huge concentration of loyalism. That's why America wasn't able to win the War of 1812. Yeah, that's what. I would say to put it sort of simply, the Quakers are like obviously you know being a bit hyperbolic here because it's obviously they're obviously all Christian, all conservative by modern standards, but the Quakers are the sort of they're what you call the sort of soy boy, liberal, lib cuck type people. Very open minded, very accepting. The name Quaker comes from the idea that anyone could like God could speak through anyone in a congregation. So like they would have you know so just like they would have these congregations, and any like a random people would start quaking and like shouting. The idea was that God could speak to any individual there, and whereas the Puritans are what you would call, I guess, an ethno state. They are very hostile to other groups. They literally burnt Quakers to death, and they're this very exclusionary um, sort of ethnocentric group where they're like, okay, we want to live in our cities. We don't want outsiders in. If you're in here, you have to be you have to follow our very sort of strict religious customs. The word Puritan comes from the fact that they wanted to sort of purify the church of all Catholic influences. They were more anti-Catholic than the other people in England, and that's sort of the culture. So like the idea of like the Quakers accepted borderers to live in Pennsylvania at first, and even though they eventually kicked them out, the Puritans would never do that. They would never even conceive of sort of accepting another group unless they would unless they were sort of very in line with their strict religious tendencies. The Puritans, interestingly, they're anti-slavery, but they're anti-slavery for a different reason than in a modern through a modern lens you would think of anti-slavery, because their reasoning was basically that we don't want any outsiders on American soil whatsoever. Whereas, slavery is mainly sort of the Southern planter culture, so it's I guess a mashup of Cavaliers and um, some borderers, but yeah, they accepted. First it was Irish indentured laborers, and then it was then eventually African slaves. But the idea of like even the idea of letting sort of Irish indentured workers who could be Catholic would have been profane to the Puritans. You have of course William Byrd. I think I'm getting his name right. Who was this? He was from the sort of Cavalier influenced Southern planter culture, and you read his diary, and it's really it's filled with really vulgar stuff. He's sort of having sex with a bunch of women, and he's using he's making women give him sort of sexual favors, and of course he says that you know he doesn't really take pride in it. He says that I hope God forgives me or whatever, but obviously he wasn't sorry enough to stop doing it. So yeah, that's the difference between the Quakers and the Puritans in crude terms.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking at the basically Massachusetts Bay Colony as the the center of Puritanism, and then it was saying that it said that something like 37 of the last 100 governors of Rhode Island have been Quakers. I'm trying to look the road Rhode Island Wikipedia isn't mentioning Quakers too much, but unfortunately, my computer's about to die in 8 minutes, so we're gonna have to cut this short. We've been going about 20 minutes here. Um, there's some interesting things we've brought up, but I'm going to have to end it now, basically, or else the stream's going to get cut off abruptly. But interesting direction. Didn't realize we'd be talking about Quakers, but interesting topics introduced. Sorry, the sound was muted for a portion of the stream, at least on my end, not you. But yeah, this is going to be a very short stream today, kind of impromptu. I'll continue to tool around with preparing these things better while I'm on the road. But in any case, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate some of the interesting topics raised, and hopefully we can continue this again sometime.
Yeah, sure.
All right, take care, man.
All right, see ya.
Bye bye.